Okay, I would like to call to order the workshop 2024, and the time is 1:36, excuse me, on the time. Today's topic is fiscal year 24-25 budget development. I would like to recognize County Manager Dave Harner.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Over the last few months, we've presented a number of different options related to the budget. Today is somewhat of a culmination of all the things that you've asked us to do. So, and then a few other components that we've added into the budget, which I'll discuss in a second, that relates to the board's directives and or concerns. So the first thing is, on our last workshop, we talked about the sheriff's budget that has been incorporated into this presentation today. Secondly, during one of our past workshops, we talked about public safety and adding those positions. So we've included that number in here in this as well, in this presentation as well. Finally, two other concerns that the board has expressed over a number of months or probably years. Code enforcement. We have major issues in code enforcement, more specifically in Lehigh, so we have included some additional positions for code enforcement in the budget. And also DOT. We've added positions for DOT specific to resurfacing and looking at potholes, obviously big issue. That includes, for DOT, that includes equipment as well as positions. So with that, I will turn it over to Pete.
Thank you, Dave. Good afternoon, Commissioners. So today is a budget workshop we have every June, and it's the first workshop that we have after you get your preliminary tax base estimate, which comes out June 1st. So at this point, you start to have some major knowns. You know, property tax revenues are 2/3 of the revenues in the general fund. The other major that you don't have from earlier in the year is early in the year we're estimating what expense budgets may come in at. At this point, we do know what's been submitted, so we can add that up and start to match the revenues and the expenses. I want to thank everyone involved in the budget development process up to this point. All of the departments, all of the fiscal managers, fiscal staff, and all of the entities in the general fund. That includes all the constitutionals and everyone else for their help in the development of preliminary budget numbers. So a question we'll ask at the end of this presentation: are there any adjustments you would like made? And one thing I want the board, I want to emphasize to the board, is July 1st, you get your final tax base estimate. So there could be an uptick in the percentage increase, which would bring in some more revenues. Also, you know, during the summer, typically the board gives us some direction at this workshop, and then during the summer we come up with strategies, we come up with options, we come up with things we can do to make sure the budget works for everybody. And we present that to you after July and August. Just to recap what's happened over the last couple of weeks, in orange there you see we received a preliminary tax base estimate of 9.65%. When I came to you in April 2nd, we were relying on the State Revenue Estimating Conference from January, the state demographers, and they had 6.2%. So this pleasant surprise, that's an additional $15 million of revenue. As you can see, last year, right after Hurricane Ian, the tax base increase was 6.67%. And then from the January Revenue Estimating Conference, you can see the next 4 years, what they're estimating as far as tax base increases. There will likely be one more revenue estimating conference before the end of this year, so we can update those numbers at that time. But at this time, that's the best information we have based on what the state economists are saying. So June 1st values, and you can see in our property tax funds, general fund, unincorporated MSTU, all hazards and library, that is the amount of increased revenues we're receiving in each fund. So you can see in the general fund it's $43 million, and unincorporated about $3.5 million. We are projecting general fund revenues of $673 million. Last year's revenues were $619 million in the adopted budget, so that's an increase of $54 million. So of that, property taxes are $43 million, and the remaining is $11 million, and the remaining is the largest other revenues are state revenue sharing, county revenue sharing from the state, electric franchise fee revenues, ambulance fees, things such as that, parks and rec fees, and a return of funds from constitutional officers. Yeah.
Go back to the price slide. So obviously we went up from 6.2 to 9.65. Each percentage is worth about $4.4 million increase.
Correct.
So obviously July goes up 1%, it's another $4.5 million.
Yes.
Okay. Just for edification, just as we go through it, because there's an additional $15 million from 6.2 to 9.65. So the 3.45% difference resulted in $15.5 million additional revenue. So just trying to give us contents of the next, obviously whatever the July numbers are, goes up 1%. Per percent, it's about $4.5 million. So if that was to go up to 10.65, it'd be another $4.5 million in revenue that we would receive.
Historically, it has gone up some. Yes, absolutely. So budget drivers, and these are the board's priorities. When I say drivers, they're the board's priorities. Public safety is the board's biggest priority. Law enforcement, the sheriff's office, and the general fund. EMS, the board has approved a number of new positions over the last few years and a number of new stations to help with the demand on the EMS system. And also another driver for everybody in the general fund is property insurance. After Hurricane Ian, property insurance rates went up incredibly, and we factored that into this budget. In the unincorporated MSTU, the biggest driver is DOT. Property insurance, because DOT pays for the insurance on the bridges that were damaged during Hurricane Ian. And then landscaping and mowing contracts that are associated with new lane miles, as well as in increases in contractual arrangements. So, Commissioners, I'm going to go through this in detail. You've seen this before, but what this shows is all the constitutionals and courts, their proposed budgets for 24-25, the Board of County Commissioners operating departments that are in the general fund, and then other can be a combination of either shared costs or mandates that the county has to pay for, CRAs, Medicaid, and major maintenance is the largest in that category because the county maintains all of the county facilities. You can see the total general fund increase. That's a blended rate of 7.66%. So this is a comparison of this year's adopted budget to next year's proposed budget in the general fund as it stands today. So we have revenues of $673 million. As I said before, last year it was $619 million, so that's a $54 million increase. Expenses of $683 million. And so when you match up those expenses with revenues, your expenses are slightly higher than your revenues, and you have a gap of $9.7 million. We have current undesignated reserves that we're projecting and forecasting for September 30th of this year of about $98 million. And then we're recommending a reserves adjustment this year. Now, last year there was a reserves adjustment from ARPA funding to help pay for EMS salaries, which by doing that, it increased our reserves. And this year, we're doing something similar. After Hurricane Ian, the county received a $25 million operating loan from the state to help with operations, as well as Sanibel and Fort Myers Beach received funding from the state. I believe those were grants. Our recommendation, and Commissioner Ruane has discussed this quite often the past few months, is our recommendation is to spend that $25 million this year for a couple of reasons. One is if we don't spend the money, well, we're hoping to get this loan extended. It currently is due in 2025, but through new legislation, we can extend that loan for up to 10 years. And then also the county is going to try to have that loan forgiven by the state. So we really need to use that for expenses now so that we can make the argument that we need to either extend that loan or it be forgiven. So if we add that into reserves, you have an adjusted reserves of $123 million. Then what you have to do is you have to apply the gap to that reserves because we're funding that gap through those reserves. So this is where the $25 million comes into play. And Commissioners, over the next couple slides, I'll show you kind of the proof of that and what the progression and the flow of those funds are through the next couple years. But what we're proposing is that the $25 million, $9.7 million of it will be used to pay for the gap or deficit for this projected for this coming year. And then the remaining balance, $15.3 million, we will use for EMS salaries. That's so we can spend it right away. However, we're just doing that. What that does basically is then that increases your ending reserves. And that's what we're trying to do in this scenario. We're trying to spend everything, increase our ending reserves, so then that will flow through 25, 26 and beyond. So that helps us in future years and potential future gaps. So when you take that out, you have adjusted reserves of $98 million. It was just what you had before. We're recommending using $5 million of reserves for, and I'll get into this later in future slides, Commissioners, for DOT equipment that is required either with or without positions. And then also the general fund CIP. As I described to you earlier, I believe about May 21st when we were going through the capital budget, we will start to run a deficit in that fund starting in 25-26. That's the fund we're using those monies to pay for the ambulance stations, and I'd like to our recommendation is to send some money to that fund in order to cover that deficit going forward. The capital is for the Sheriff's Office of $10.6 million. This assumes that they have $700,000 in their operating budget, which they usually have for capital expenses. If they don't, then we can always add that in here. And then you have ending reserves of about $82 million compared to $82 million last year. And then just briefly, I will show you, this is your 5-year forecast for the general fund. And I'll pull up some of the lines here. I'm not going to go through this in detail, but it kind of shows you what happens, where your deficits end, and you start to have surpluses in the out years, and then what happens to your reserves as you're going through all this. Now, right now, this assumes that $25 million isn't in there. So here's the tax base that I alluded to in a prior slide. Total revenues. Revenues this year of $673.5 million. Next year, $703 million. Expenses. So expenses this year of $683 million, next year of $720. So something I want to show here is that, as we said earlier, we had about a $9 million deficit, or forecasted deficit for 24-25. And then if you go to 25-26, you see your revenues are $703 million and your expenditures are $720 million. So that's just less than a $17 million deficit. Then when you go into the out years, you can see that your revenues start to exceed your expenditures. Some of that has to do with just growth in revenues. And another part of it is we're in a high debt environment in the general fund, and that debt goes away, so then that can drop down to the bottom line. So your reserves, you can see that in 25-26, they drop down to the $71 million range, then they come back up to 77, then they go back to 97, up to 121. I don't think they would be that high because I think there'll be other needs of the county. But you can see you go into a deficit, you're eating into reserves, then it comes back out. So this is where the use of that loan comes through. So as I said before, the $25 million loan, which we are going to get extended and then ask for forgiveness. In 24-25, we're paying for the $9.7 million deficit. We are paying for $15.3 million of EMS salaries. That equals $25 million. Then you'll see in the next slide, our recommendation is to hold that $15.3 million for next year in a designated reserve and apply that reserve next year to your forecasted deficit. Hopefully the forecasted deficit won't be as much as we anticipated, but that would cover the majority of that deficit. And you'd have a very small deficit remaining. And what that would do is you will see it evens out your reserves. Instead of your reserves dropping down into the low 70s, potentially high 60s, it will remain in that $80 million range. So kind of the proof of that and how that $25 million loan flows through is you have your beginning reserves I alluded to earlier. You have your revenues plus the $25 million. You apply your expenses. You apply, and then what you have left for that $113 million is you have a designated reserve for future deficit of $15.3 million and an undesignated reserve of $98 million. And then you take expenses from that undesignated reserve. It's not the same $15 million. It's that 10 capital for the sheriff, and that's 5 for the county for DOT and general fund CIP. So don't conflate the two. They're both 15 million, but that's just by coincidence. You take that out and you have an ending reserve, as I alluded to earlier, of 82 million. And next year you have your beginning reserve of 82 million. You add in that designated reserve that you've been holding. So you add that 15 million to the 82 million. That gives you a new beginning reserve of 97 million. Revenues of 703 million, you take out expenses of 720 million, and you end up in an ending reserve of about 80 million. Now remember, in the prior slide, it was going to dip down all the way to 70 million, so you've evened out that reduction in your reserves. This all assumes that your tax base increase, not in 24-25, but 25-26 is going to be 6.1%. If we think it's going to be higher, then we'll do better and we won't have as much of a deficit. I can tell you that we've worked this out. If we still have 9.65% increase, we're still going to have a slight deficit, but it won't be nearly that $16 million plus. Okay, and then the next big fund that we'll go through today is the unincorporated MSTU fund. This pays for services that are provided only in the unincorporated areas and not countywide, which the general fund does. So you can see the departments in that: community parks, community development, animal services. The sheriff's budget is split between general fund, and then we have the school resource officers and some of the youth services that are provided in the unincorporated area. We pay that out of the unincorporated MSTU. The big expense in this fund is the transfer we do to DOT. We do a transfer to DOT each year of property tax revenues in order for DOT to operate. So that's highly subsidized by the general taxpayer. And you can see that's gone up quite a bit, as I alluded to before. The drivers are property insurance on the bridges, landscaping, and mowing, both a combination of increased lane miles as well as increases in contractual arrangements. And so you can see the total increase in the unincorporated MSTU fund budget is 6.59%. So if we go through the same model as we did with the general fund, you have your existing millage, you have revenues, you have expenses. The expenses slightly exceed the revenues. That $1.7 million out of an $80 million fund is not a big deal. We have healthy reserves in that fund, and you can see where we end up as far as percentage of reserves. And then here is your unincorporated MSTU, as I showed you before, with the general fund, a projection, your tax base increases, your revenues, your expenses. You can see that after 25-26, you're almost in parity, you're almost balanced, And then finally, in 27, 28, you have a slight surplus. That's a fairly tight fund. Ending reserves and percentages. And then, Commissioners, these are not included in the existing budget, but the board had asked specifically at the May 21st workshop. We didn't have positions for EMS to go along with either some of the stations or some of the new units that we were going to have in certain areas in order for coverage. And so the board asked, what would that cost if you were to bring those positions forward? So in the general fund, 10 EMT paramedic positions that would be in Cape Coral would be a $480,000 cost. 2 critical care positions, $180,000, and 4 communications positions, $240,000 for an additional $900,000. And if the board wants us to factor this into the budget, that's what we can work through between July 1st and the next budget workshop that we hold in August. And then in the unincorporated MSTU, there are some positions that we would recommend funding either wholly or partially this year, and that is 10 positions based on just the number of roadways, how old the roadways are, how much we're adding to the roadways. It's roughly 2 positions each: drainage, paving, mowing, and signals. That's $840,000, and then equipment. Now, that $3 million of equipment isn't all for those positions. There's some large equipment that we have to replace in DOT that we're adding into that number. And then for code enforcement, which is paid through property taxes, recommendation would be to hire 2 additional officers, primarily for the Lehigh Acres area, and then 1 administrative staff with the equipment that goes along with those positions. If you add all that up in the unincorporated MSTU, that's $4.3 million, but not all of that is recurring costs. About $1 million of that is a recurring cost, $1.1 million. So our upcoming workshops, the board will set the maximum millage rate July 30th, and that's a single item meeting. You're just going to set the tax rate, and that's the end of that meeting. And then the first meeting back in August, we'll provide a second draft of the budget workshop based on the board's input and direction today, the July 1st final tax base assessment, as well as any strategies we can come up with in July. August 20th, final draft of the budget, and then your budget public hearings in September. So with that, Commissioners, the final question is, are there any adjustments you would like made to this, to the budget development as it stands right now? And open it up for discussion and questions.
All right, so at this time, Commissioners have any questions for staff?
I guess I'll really kick it off. Pete, great. Thank you for the information. Thanks for the presentation. So I still support, we talked earlier in the year about the 10 EMS positions in Cape Coral, and it sounds like a lot of people, but in reality, when you have 160 hours a week coverage 24/7, it's only basically like 1.5 personnel at a time working. So 10 people sounds like a lot of, like a whole ship. In reality, when you do it 7/24, it's basically 1.5 person per ship working. So definitely support that. Code enforcement, obviously, we have some challenges there, not because of code cases, it's because of the growth. For example, I think Pete mentioned Lehigh. You're averaging 35 to 4,000 homes a year being built in Lehigh. So even at the rate of increase in 2 officers, you're still planning to play catch up because we're so understaffed in those departments already. So definitely support that. And probably in the future, we'll probably be looking at more positions there because of that. And also we'll be talking later, not budget-wise, about the code laws, ordinances, so we can have more enforcement. But the personnel obviously needs some more help out there with all the code cases because as more people move in, as more development, as more code cases coming in. So definitely support that, and I support the budget as it is now like this. So again, thank you for preparing this, and support our law enforcement sitting here in the room with us, and look forward to another great year.
Mr. Chairman, anything? Commissioner Rain?
Appreciate you. I'm sorry, Commissioner Pendergrass's comments on the recommended county positions? That's it, okay, great. So really, the biggest impact is in the MSTU.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah.
So reoccurring is the top number, obviously, and then some of the admin staff and the offices below?
Correct, that the
Okay,
10.
so the equipment, obviously, and the MSTU items would be one-time expenditures?
Correct, and I would look, as we go through, Commissioner, if the board wants these positions added into the budget, for some of that equipment, I would look at a combination of probably some unincorporated MSTU reserves, potentially the vehicle replacement fund, doing some reprioritization in that. So there's some things that we can do to take the edge off on that.
I'm all in favor of, so we're going through a population growth right now, which, I don't know how we don't address issues and personnel. Obviously, EMS is essential. We need to do that. I also, forwarded everyone, with the population growth, we're also going through the same issues with the sheriff's offices. They need to put more boots. I guess a couple of points of view. Appreciate your budget. I think we get a lot of relief when we pay the debt down, that $25 million, right? That's where we really start to hit hands. So really, it's the next 2 years we got to get through?
Yes.
Okay.
And the projection, Commissioner, just to clarify also, I have growth increment funding suspended for the next couple of years. The board did it this year also, but we were able to add that in. So the hope is always we can add it back in after the final results for the year. But going forward, once we're in that surplus position, I've got that fully loaded in the projection also.
So obviously, what we have to look forward to is property value increases to July. 1%, as I'd indicated earlier, is about $4.5 million. Last year, ironic enough, that 2023, we met on June 20th, and we ended reserves with $76 million. I have the presentation in front of me. So today we have 82. So we have $6 million greater than the capacity. So not only could we pay for these positions that you need, but I also know that the sheriff's asked for 30 additional boots on the ground, and certainly want to make sure we do that. Even with that in mind, the impact, we wouldn't be any less than where we left reserves last year at 76.6, because right now we're at $82.2 million. So the additional personnel, I am all in favor of making sure we respond. I think in our strategic planning, we all talked about first responders being the most essential that we need to do. And with the population growth we're going through, I don't know how we don't continue to do that. The other thing is, I just question, inside the budget, you have a raise of 5%, and that's $7.3 million increase to the budget?
I
If I'm not mistaken?
I believe for BoCC departments, it's, just getting that slide.
My memory serves me correct.
It's 7.3 million, yes.
Okay, so theoretically, each percent about 1.45?
Correct.
Okay, so the only thing that we should take into consideration is core inflation's at 3.4%. So 5% is certainly an increase that I recognize, but when you look at inflationary times, and I've always been, this is 18th year of me doing this, so I've always been a believer that when we do have the ability to do what we can, we try to help our employees. And then obviously when property values in our favor, no different than 09 times for 6 years, there weren't any increases. So I'm just open to, I'm glad there's 5% in here, but I'm probably open to 6% and not just 5%. It's another 1.4. We have the ability to do so, and only because property values are up. I also do believe that property values will be greater than the 6.1, because you have to recognize that Sanibel's values were still a negative 1%. Fort Myers Beach obviously had, a very big increase, yet they're still $2 billion off their taxable value. Sanibel is about $2.5 billion off of taxable values. In talking with Matt Caldwell, what we do on assessed values is if the building has been impaired, there's just a $10 value, so until they come online. So I appreciate the revenue conferences, and I think those information are probably good for other counties. But when you take into consideration that we're still recovering and taxable values have no place to go from $10 other than up, you'll see that additional increase. Is that a fair assessment? Okay. So, again, when you try to look at budgets, I'm comfortable with what you presented. I certainly want to make sure that we keep in front of this population growth. We try to do it with infrastructure. I think we've done a great job. We need to do it with staff so we don't burn our staff out, whether it's EMS or whether it's, the 1,300 plus sheriffs that we have on the road. We just need to make sure we stay in front of them. The other thing that you need to take into consideration is that it's a cash flow impact. So as much as we want to hire EMS or we want to hire additional personnel, it still takes time to do that. So it's not going to have an immediate impact. We do this budget process, and every year since I've been here, we've had $20+ million of carryovers because we don't spend all our money. We left last year's budget with $76 million. We walk into the adjustment before you put the $25 million in at 97. So it went up some $21 million, predominantly because we didn't spend the money. And that's basically all a cash flow issue. I always look at the way I run my business as cash flow being the item. So it's great to be conservative, and since I've sat here, I've never had you come in with a revenue forecast that was under when we got to the reality. And I've never had an expenditure that hasn't been under in what you forecasted. So we have the benefit of revenues obviously being conservatively forecasted and expenses the same way. But there are give and takes in both those items. So the thing that I want to bring to everyone's attention is that there was an ask for additional personnel because of growth from the sheriff's office, and I was in favor of doing that. So they initially approached me, and we're going to do it as a blue sheet. I just thought it was germane to this conversation. We certainly have the ability, and if we just left reserves exactly where we did last year, we could absorb that, pay the additional people from EMS as well as them, and not have any impact whatsoever. And that doesn't take into consideration whether we have an increase in property values come July 1. And historically, we've seen even last year being anemic, it still went up. The recovery is only going to be better. So those are my comments.
Thank you, Commissioner. I'll go ahead. Anything, Commissioner Hammond?
Briefly, I don't have too much more to add. I think it's been amazing what was shared so far. I do want to thank, just because we have an opportunity, we have about a dozen folks from the Lee County Sheriff's Office who've joined us today in the audience, and I'm so glad you guys are here. We don't really get a chance to show you how much we appreciate you face to face like this. So I would love it if we could jump back to slide 7 for a second. Good, we're on there. We say it, but I want you guys to know we put our money where our mouth is. We say we love law enforcement, but since we have been here since 2017 and 2018, we've also put our money where our mouth is, and we want you to know we appreciate what you do for our community. So if you look at the difference on the sheriff line from 17-18's fiscal year to 18-19, you'll see we did a $9 million increase in the sheriff's budget. The next year, if you just keep going down the line, we did a $6 million increase. The year after that, we did a $5 million increase. The year after that, we did a $17 million increase to the sheriff's budget. Now, I don't know what happened here, but we duplicated columns. We've got 21, 22 in there twice. So we'll have to correct that slide. But then if you look to the 22-23 year, we increased by $25 million. And then last year, we increased by $35 million. And then this year, if we go to the 323, I think that the sheriff's looking for, that'll be about a $51 million increase to the sheriff's budget. So we definitely understand the value of having a safe community of law enforcement in our community, and we have demonstrated it by putting our money where our mouth is. It's not just talk, it's money that's come that way. So.
Thank you, Commissioner Hammond. And I feel exactly the same way. Commissioner Rain, I agree. We have to keep up with staff, and that goes with the Sheriff's Department and our deputies out there as well as EMS. And I know we obviously are making that effort. Just to add the one thing that Commissioner Pendergrass said is we do have a tremendous problem in Lehigh with code enforcement and the illegal dumping people actually going out and digging up people's property and hauling off dirt. So we need, if it, all in this budget, if it's possible, after we get into July, if it's possible to add a third officer, code enforcement officer, I think would be hugely appreciated for the people of Lehigh, because they're so spread out there, and the amount of illegal dumping, and it's just hard to fathom that someone could put their equipment on a piece of property and dig the dirt out of it and haul it off, and nothing happened to them. So we have to stop that. I'm all for everything you guys said. I think you guys are doing a great job, and that's my 2 cents, so thank you. Mr. Harner?
Could I
yes.
echo his comments? So I agree with you, Commissioner Greenwell. Commissioner Hammond, you make a great point. You know what is a little bit hard to follow the bouncing ball in our budget. So the sheriff's budget was 318. So it's a combination of 301 in our budget, $10 million that are taken out of reserve for equipment and capital, and then 5.7 that are in MST. That comes to the 318. So the 323 is obviously a $5 million increase, but just so we're comparing an apple to an apple, we did leave reserves at 76 million last year. We're at 82 million this year, and we don't have the benefit of having a property appraisers numbers come in. Again, if I just use 1%, we're at another $4.5 million, coupled with the fact that we have an additional $6 million above in reserves than we did last year. And I'm not necessarily as pessimistic because of the recovery we're still going through. I spent a lot of time with Matt Colwell on assessed values, trying to understand, how do we do this? Because how did we get such a big increase in Fort Myers Beach? Well, you go from a property that either gets suppressed because it's a commercial property, you can't raise it more than 10%. So when Fran's RV Park sold, it was 10 million on the books, it went to 35. You know, so when you have those changes in properties and or a new owner has it, that's where we get our growth management funding, but that's where the real spikes are. So, you know, knowing the assessed value or the taxable value in Sanibel was still $2.6 million, $2.6 billion away from that, and the beach has about another $2 billion. So as much as we saw the big increase this year, which a lot of it was attributed to Fort Myers Beach, we still have those coming. Again, as these properties come online, as these hotels are built, I mean, so I appreciate the revenue conference, but I think we're in a little bit of a different, unique situation because of the recovery, because all it's going to do is have a higher taxable value, because if it's $10, when it gets improved, you shoot up to $1 million of property value. So it's just important to understand. And I just want to make sure that we put our heads on the pillow at night and we make sure that public safety is our #1 priority. And I'm glad they're all here. I can't thank you all enough. You guys are awesome, ladies. What you do for us, I get to put my head on the pillow at night. But as far as I'm concerned, I'd rather worry about the dollars and cents and let you worry about the streets, because you guys do a great job doing that. So thank you very much from the bottom of my heart. I don't have any other comments.
Mr. Harner, is there any further discussion?
Yes, I just want to make sure I've captured everything. So in August, we will come back, the next workshop, to include the additional sheriff's request. We will also come forward at the August board meeting with the sheriff's blue sheet. The very first meeting in August, they included a blue sheet, so we'll bring that back on August 1st. We will add a third code enforcement officer as well. And from that point, you support the rest of the budget as it is established.
Yes.
Okay.
Okay, is there any further discussion?
The other conversation I had with make sure everyone is at least consider 6%. Just to verify that cost maybe in August.
Yes. Yes, we'll bring that cost back to you as well. I apologize, I forgot that.
No problem.
Okay.
That would be, I think
Just like an additional percentage.
yeah, and that wouldn't just be for the county departments. I think you gotta assume that the constitutionals would do the same amount, then they'd step up to the 6%.
Correct.
Pete, thank you for you, and any further business in front of us? Seeing
sir.
none? workshop.